Welcome to the Leonard Baskin, the great American artist and contributor to the FDR Memorial. Today's event is hosted by the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee. My name is Kelly Palmer. It is my pleasure to introduce Mary Dolan, co-founder and executive director of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mary Dolan. I'm co-founder and executive director of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee. The FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, and we call it FDR Committee for short, was founded in 2019 as a citizen-led organization with the mission to promote education about the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. I want to thank Richard Michelson and Thaisa Way for joining me in this webinar today. Rich runs the R. Michelson Gallery in Northampton, Massachusetts. He is an award-winning poet, an award-winning children's book author, including books written with Leonard Baskin. Rich also recently added librettist. I have to be careful how I say it because it's a new word for me, librettist, to his ever-growing portfolio. Rich knew Leonard. He was his friend, mentee, and colleague. And Rich, we're thankful for you for taking the time today to be with us, to share your stories and knowledge, and for taking us on a journey of discovery about the great Leonard Baskin. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be able to join you all. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about Leonard Baskin's career, for those who are not familiar with the full breadth of his work. Then I'll speak briefly about how our relationship came to be. He was my mentor and friend. Before I delve into the topic of the FDR Memorial and Baskin's contribution, if the power of the visual could be explicated, we would have little need for the art itself. Nonetheless, I shall rely on the precedent of Leonard Baskin himself, a man of many words, and many of those found in only the thickest dictionaries, to allow myself to encapsulate a creativity which for 5 decades was a dominant voice among the chorus of world artists. Baskin's work is in the permanent collections of most of the world's major museums, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery in Washington, the Vatican. He's been the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Scholarship, a Tiffany Fellowship, the medals of both the American Institute of Graphic Arts and the National Institute of Letters. He was a recipient of the Jewish Cultural Achievement Award given by the National Foundation of Jewish Culture. Other recipients include Elie Wiesel, Itzhak Perlman, Philip Roth. So there is a long history of contributions and recognitions for this great artist. But there are at least 6 Leonard Baskins, each with enough achievement for any single lifetime. There is Baskin, the author of more than 20 books, with his searing comments on other important and often overlooked artists. There is Baskin, whose Gehenna Press is the grandfather of fine art bookmaking in this country and the longest running private press that exists. I'm pleased personally to have had the opportunity to collaborate on 2 Gehenna Press books with Leonard Baskin. There's also Baskin, the Caldecott-honored children's book illustrator. Many people are unfamiliar with his many children's books because his work for adults is so prominent. But Leonard loved children. He loved to draw for them. We collaborated, the 2 of us, on 4 different children's books. It was fun. It was a great experience for me to be able to work with him on these books, and something that I will remember for my entire life. There's also Baskin, the watercolorist, whose explosion of color burst unexpectedly in mid-career, like fireworks across his previously black sky. There's also Baskin, the printmaker, who, among other achievements, reinvented the monumental woodcut as fine art. And at the core, there's Baskin, the sculptor, who, in the estimation of many, including himself, was the preeminent sculptor of his time. As Leonard said, not because I am so great, though I am, but because all the others are so dreadful. For focus today, I think we're going to touch upon just the last Baskin I mentioned. Baskin made sculptures for over 65 of his 78 years, professionally for over 53. In The Mourning Mother, which is up on the screen, it's a wood carving from the mid-40s. A woman's head is tilted back in anguish, her lips parted in sorrow, her arm thrust toward heaven, hand outstretched. It is a powerful political and human statement, even if a bit sentimentalized for its time. But it already contains classic Baskin iconography, the solitary figure, the direct frontal gaze, and the struggle to understand. In the 1994 Holocaust Memorial cited in Ann Arbor, the same arm stretches towards the same heavens. Now the head is bowed, the face covered, searching inward, creating a tension between the individual and the world inhabited. There is a stillness at the core of this grief, making it even more horrible. The figure is wrapped, the brown folds of the garment giving rhythmic pattern, weight, and bulk. Like a written sonnet, the form controls the passion, enlarging both. So very early in his career, Baskin came to the conclusion that sculpture was the medium best suited to expressing fundamental human states, such as grief, love, hope, and dignity. Its very monumentality makes it an art of witness, not ideology. For expression of a more direct political need, in the 1940s, Baskin turned to printmaking, the perfect medium for a young man with communist sympathies. Prints were cheap, easily distributed, and their message could be plain, even cut directly into the block, as were done for such early works as The Rich Man's Whore and Capitalist. I should note that these works are no longer so cheap. Communist viewpoints often soften with achievement and huge mortgage payments, but with its intricate network of sinewy anatomical lines, delicate and twisted, Baskin found in engraving a way to depict both the inner maelstrom and the outer physicality of the human form at once. In his last series of woodcuts, it is interesting to note that Baskin again mixed text and images in a series of 6-foot woodcuts directly confronting the horror of the Holocaust, with titles such as "At Least Death Loves the Jews" and "I Lie Here Dead While His Godly Name Grows Ever Greater and Ever Holier." We see the direct address of his earliest works mixed with the immense size of his classic woodblocks of the 50s, such as The Man of Peace and The Hanged Man. We also see the jarringly intense colors of the Angels to the Jews in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In Baskin's many lithographs and gouache portraits of the most heroic among us, including the biblical matriarchs and patriarchs, I've got those opposite here, up to his 30-foot-long relief, bronze relief of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's funeral procession for the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. Baskin focuses on the plain humanity of his subjects, the moment of their greatest connection with the common people. We're going to get back to that moment as it pertains to the funeral cortege and the FDR Memorial in a moment. Mostly, Baskin's work is populated by Jews and Blacks, women, Native Americans, and the marginalized in society are given center stage, one figure at a time, with their weary eyes and massive bodies. Their despair and hope are given emotional weight by Baskin's stylistic devices. His images crowd the actual sheets they are printed on. His hands and eyes are distorted for expressive purposes. Baskin's vision is often a dark one, but it is the brilliance of our fight, our survival against the odds, our attempt at communication and understanding that constitute the glory of humanity and exist always at the core of Baskin's art. Baskin shocks us. He shows us the horror, and yet I submit his pessimistic images are born of his optimism. Baskin sees the glory of life even in death. His faces are often those of survivors, those who can look at the worst life has to offer in the face, those who can acknowledge evil and continue to exist and hope. As Baskin says, our human frame, our gutted mansion, our enveloping sack of beef and ash is yet a glory. Glorious in defining our universal sodality and glorious in defining our uniqueness. The human figure is the image of all. It contains all and it expresses all. Where others find only horror, he can find truth and therefore beauty. Heroic and common, despairing and hopeful, God-defying and steeped in Judaism, Baskin is an artist whose art occupies the moment of contradiction. Baskin's relentless pursuit of his themes has been so encompassing that to call a work Baskin-like conveys an unsentimental confrontation with mortality and the political forces of his time. Which is why in 1978, when the FDR committee was looking for a sculptor to memorialize FDR for the ages, Baskin was one of the 4 sculptors they called. You heard that right, in 1978, 33 years after FDR's death. But even that is not the beginning of this memorial I am here to discuss. So let's dig in and see how your government actually works. In 1946, after World War II ended, Congress approved a resolution to establish a commission to create a memorial. In 1955, the FDR Memorial Commission was established, and the committee consisted of 4 architects, a landscape architect, 2 designers, and they chose 6 acres along the tidal basin between the Lincoln and Jefferson Memorial as the site. In 1960, a competition was held for the design of the memorial, and the firm of Peterson and Tilney won, and the Memorial Commission gave its approval. But the Federal Commission of Fine Arts objected. So in 1966, 55 architectural firms were invited to submit a design, and this time Marcel Breuer was selected. But once again, the Federal Commission of Fine Arts objected. So in 1972, the FDR Memorial Commission invited the Federal Commission of Fine Arts to participate in the selection process. A pretty smart move. In 1974, 7 architects were invited to submit a design, and landscape architect Lawrence Halpern was chosen to design the memorial. This time, there was no objection. So after 500 rejected designs, we had a winner. Halpern's final design incorporates recreation, the waterway, the park settings, the gardens, forestry, that all help to contextualize Roosevelt's life. But how do you portray a man whose memory cannot be contained in a single sculpture? How do you symbolically celebrate his life? Well, you commission multiple sculptural images within the memorial grounds. The memorial was conceived as a sculptural landscape within granite walls with inscribed quotations by John Benson. The quotations, of course, were FDR, but John Benson sculpted them. And the viewer moves through 4 rooms, each memorializing the 4 terms in office. Stylistic diversity within thematic unity. Halpern contacted artistic experts to give him a list of the most prominent figurative sculptors in the US at the time. The commission chose Neil Estern, Robert Graham, George Siegel, and Leonard Baskin. And yes, I have their picture up on the screen right now. And as you see, they are all older white men. That was the time that we were dealing in, and that who was chosen among a list of, I believe it was about 25 to 30 different sculptors that they had settled on. Work finally started in 1991. So why the delay? Well, in 1978, the memorial was approved under Carter. But in 1981, Reagan decided to cut the funding because he didn't want a Democratic president championed while he was running the country. So for the next 8 years, the memorial was planned, but there was absolutely no money to move ahead. George Bush, the senior, finally allowed it to begin, but it wasn't until 1991 that the work actually started. And in 1993, when Clinton was elected, it was all full steam ahead. The memorial was dedicated 25 years ago in 1997. And for me, especially, it was just a wonderful time. I got to go down to the memorial. There's my family on the screen behind me with my wife and my children. Our representative at the time, Richard Neal, brought us to the dining room, the dining room to eat. He is still in DC at the moment. There's Leonard Baskin and myself. There were many dignitaries there that we got to meet. Mike Wallace spoke. A couple of rows ahead of me was Ted Kennedy and John Kerry. It was great fun. But how did these sculptors decide to split things up? I'm going to move quickly now until we get to Leonard Baskin, because he is who we are focusing on today. But basically, Robert Graham, you see some of his pieces behind me here. He did a image of 54 programs called social programs initiated in FDR under the New Deal. The names of each program were also written in Braille, and we're also going to come back to Graham at the end very quickly. Originally, we also had Neil Estern, who did the very popular sculpture of FDR and Fala. He also did a sculpture of Eleanor. We had George Siegel, and there's a picture I took on the screen of George Siegel with his famous work of the unemployed men, and there is the radio broadcast that FDR did, who was really FDR, was elected because of the Depression, and he helped pull us out of it. Leonard Baskin himself was originally commissioned for 3 works. Now we're going to get to the background information that a lot of people don't know. He was commissioned to do a relief of the commander-in-chief. And this is actually the FDR Commission's original mock-up of a sculpture that Baskin did that was taken from a famous picture of FDR on the chief of the Navy vessel as commander-in-chief, a watercolor that Baskin did while he was working on his bronze. There was also a sculpture of the Day of Infamy speech that FDR gave after Pearl Harbor when the US was entering the war. And then finally, there was the funeral cortege, which we are going to focus on in a moment. What happened to the other 2 pieces that are not part of the memorial? Well, as it happened, that Baskin referenced some images of Roosevelt giving his speech. It was a dramatic speech. His veins were popping. It was a matter of life and death and war. This is a watercolor. But the committee who chose Baskin decided that this work looked too, as they said, Baskin-like. They asked him to tone it down. Well, Baskin agreed to redo it as long as they could provide a photo of FDR giving an impassioned speech with his mouth closed and while he was smiling. Those of you who know Leonard Baskin as a person are probably not surprised to hear that. So was it punishment that they also scrapped the naval commander bronze? This I don't know. But we did end up with the famous sculpture, which is really the culmination of the entire memorial, the funeral cortege. There you see on the screen Leonard Baskin. That is the day of the dedication where he's standing and enjoying watching his sculpture. And there I am as well, standing in front of it. It was a great day. In the funeral cortege, the streets were blocked off and a motorcade followed actually the hearse, which you see. But Leonard Baskin decided, and you'll hear him mention this very shortly, he decided that while the streets were blocked off and people were not allowed to follow the hearse, in his rendition of the cortege, he took down those barriers and allowed people to follow. And he had lots of people following. There you see the ceremonial horse, the watercolor he did. You see some of the people he sculpted following. And among the people following, if you look closely, you will see portraits of James Baldwin, who was a good friend of Leonard Baskin's. You will see portraits of Baskin's family members, FDR family members. You will see Sid Kaplan, who was the editor of the Gehenna Press. He invited the general public to follow that hearse and to be part of the procession. I did complain to Leonard at that night that I didn't see myself following that hearse, and he was nice enough when we got home to create a bronze relief just of myself, which I'm very proud to have. I want to talk, before I come back to Baskin, just for a moment. Where is the wheelchair? That's a question a lot of people ask. It deserves more time than I'm going to give it, but as it doesn't really affect Baskin's contribution, it's better left, I think, for another lecture. But I do have a slide up of the final sculpture there. It was not really an oversight. It was a contested decision. Even when I was at the dedication of the memorial, I have to say there were folks out there picketing and handing out flyers, complaining that there was no depiction of FDR in a wheelchair. As most people now know, FDR was diagnosed with polio at the age of 39, and he had limited use of his legs. He used a wheelchair throughout his presidency. It was an open secret, certainly within the administration. Yet the fear was that the public would not think him strong enough to lead with this more general knowledge. And FDR took great pains to not be photographed in his wheelchair or using crutches. There are very, very few, I think only 3 or 4 photographs that we have of him in a wheelchair. He went to great pains to hide his disability. So when the commission was deciding what to do and how to memorialize him, there was a discussion. Do you memorialize a person who did not want to be depicted in a wheelchair? Or was this disrespectful to his memory to then show him as he did not want to be seen? But of course, there was another side to that. This is a memorial not necessarily for FDR, but for the country itself and for future generations. Depicting the great leader with a disability is empowering to everyone with a disability. And this, I believe, is how society moves ahead. Put in a little side here, not by people like Donald Trump, who made fun of a reporter's disability, which I thought right then and there would sink his run. But I'm not here to talk about that either. And don't get me started, please. FDR was a great president, not in spite of his disability, but it could be argued he was a great president because of it. As Eleanor Roosevelt herself said, Franklin's illness gave him strength and courage he had not had before. He had to think out the fundamentals of living and learn the greatest of all lessons, infinite patience and never-ending persistence. So in 1997, Robert Graham, one of the original sculptors, was tasked to create the bronze, which is on the screen now, and which greets you on the way into the memorial. It was funded by the National Organization on Disability with private donations, and the statue was dedicated on January 10th, 2001.
When FDR died, I still remember vividly Arthur Godfrey's tearful radio description of the procession that led the caisson bearing the president's body through the streets of Washington, and the newsreels that showed the affection and the sadness etched into the faces of everyone who lined the streets here on that day. That moment is now captured on bronze inside the memorial.
I tried to show the deep sorrow of the people. I looked at hundreds of thousands of photographs of the actual funeral. You know, the cortege was followed, the catafalque and the coffin was followed by Cadillacs and Oldsmobiles, not by human beings. And this first horse draping ceremony happened only at Hyde Park. But I reinvented the entire funeral, having the people who were crying on the sidewalk following his coffin. People were overwhelmingly moved.
What I've noticed about was the hands of all of your people.
Yeah, people are clutching each other, touching each other, reaching for each other.
Mm-hmm.
The marvelous sense of
I could possibly do it by having them move into the hands and the arms and the legs. It's all very calculated. All done in the clay. Which have been two of the stupidest world wars the world has ever seen. It's a century of the Holocaust in which 6 million people were destroyed willfully. And just think of the wars around the world right now. Think of Africa. Think of Bosnia. Think of Algeria. Think of what's going on in what was the Soviet Union. Such a happy time we're living in. What should I do? Still lives of grapes and mussels? No.
I thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rich. That was an incredible education and journey. What an incredible experience you've had to spend time with someone who's made such an impact on the collective memory of our country. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I want to ask Dr. Way to lead off with a question.
Sure. First, I have to say thank you, Rich. I've been to that memorial more times than I can count, and you've added another layer of richness to those stories. So I really appreciate that. I want to talk to you as in reference to an earlier conversation, your comment about the various mourners that are behind on this cortege. And it seems like a beautiful moment where Baskin is really extending FDR's legacy to suggest something maybe even greater than FDR imagined. And I just wondered whether I'm reading into it or whether you think that Baskin thought he was doing what FDR would have wanted, or was he in fact suggesting something, even greater and more inclusive than maybe FDR would have.
Well, I think if I can, let me see if I can pull this up. Baskin did say that that FDR was the only president he voted for in his lifetime who won the election, and that he was far and away the greatest president of his lifetime. And he said it would be ages before we would see the likes of the man like that again. So, so Leonard, who was very, very politically active throughout his life, the whole Baskin family is politically active. His wife, Lisa, ran for office and was always on the forefront of various campaigns. The children are all, I would say, to the left of left wing in general, and Leonard was as well. He was friends with many, as you know, he was very good friends with James Baldwin. We already mentioned that. Jesse Jackson, he did a campaign poster for him. So Leonard, the show that we have up right now in our gallery, which you see behind me, is called Baskin in Politics. So Leonard was involved. He certainly didn't agree, I'm sure, with every policy of FDR, but I think that he did feel he was a great president. And also, I think the work he did was both, as you say, to memorialize FDR, but also the eye was on the greater country. He was always championed the common man, as it were, or man and woman, I should say, and I think this memorial does that. I mean, everybody stands in front of it, and you can see the emotion take over. They see themselves, they see their family, they see their loved ones, and it's both sad but also inspiring to know that a person like that existed who made such a difference in so many people's lives.
You point out something that I've always experienced, but I didn't articulate until you were talking about it. It's a memorial that's absolutely human size, right? You walk through it and the granite stones are huge, but there is a human scale to it that isn't always true at memorials. And that seems to also fit in with FDR's compassion for the common person at the common scale, as it were.
I like to think FDR would have been very pleased with Baskin's funeral cortege.
Yeah, no, and it's a beautiful piece. Mary, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Rich, you spoke a bit about that Leonard Baskin was maybe a bit of a character, a robust personality. And I came across something that Larry Halpern wrote in his book about making the memorial, that he said the interviews and interactions with the sculptors during the creative selection process were among the most interesting and provocative of my life. And I thought that, coming from Larry Halpern, says a lot, because he met a lot of people and he was a character himself. So what would it have been like hanging out with Baskin? What would it have been like for that day with Larry Halpern going in and seeing Baskin? If you can just give us some vignettes, that would be wonderful.
Baskin was not the easiest person to get along with. Many people found him very difficult. He was opinionated. He was, I have to say, for me, probably, he was the only really true genius I have met in my life. He knew everything about everything. When the first time he met my wife, who speaks fluent Dutch, he started speaking to her in Dutch. If you were watching baseball, he knew the statistic. If you were a brain surgeon, he would tell you the latest brain surgery techniques that you didn't yet know. When I first met him, I used to think it was almost a parlor trick. I would go to his library, which was one of the great libraries that this country has ever known. There are actually books about his libraries. And he would say to me things like, Michelson, to prove a point, go to the sixth shelf, fourth book in, and turn to page 490, and you will see what I'm talking about. And I used to say to myself, how did he get the conversation around to that particular book? But over time, I realized that it was not a trick. He read prodigiously, he remembered things, he knew things. But conversation with Baskin could be a verbal joust to the end. It was not easy. You tried to keep up with him as best you could, knowing you were going to lose. So for a lot of people, he could be very dismissive. If you said, oh, Mr. Baskin, I love your work. He wasn't interested in that. He wasn't interested in fawning. If you wanted to talk about it in an intelligent way and say why you liked it or what it meant to you or what didn't work, then it was a great conversation. He was not one for small talk. On the other hand, I have to say that nobody was, he loved children. He loved to play with children, partly because they said what they thought. They didn't couch it in social niceties. If he thought you were serious, he could be a great friend. To me, he was a wonderful friend and mentor. He was there for his friends. He was lovely. But he could also, he could be very difficult because he said what he thought. He was honest, we might say, to a fault. So if you asked him what he thought about something, he would tell you. So
Yeah.
I'm sure he and Lawrence Halpern had some interesting conversation.
I'm sure they did, because you could take much of that description and apply it to Halpern as well. On that point, I'm curious, we talk about it as Baskin's work at here. Did he mentor younger sculptors? Were there others that were working with him in his studio, or was he somebody who really worked the whole process out on his own?
No, he certainly had. If he thought you were a serious artist and a good artist, he would take you under his wing. He taught both at Smith College and Hampshire College. You know, if you were wanting to live the life of an artist, you thought you were an artist without putting in the work, you would be dismissed. But if you were willing to learn how to draw, and if you were willing to put in the time, he was the hardest working man that I knew. He would get up every day, all day, and work late at night on his sculpture, his drawings, his paintings. And he would do it the next day again and the next day again. No holidays, this and that. But he mentored many people. The artist Barry Mosher, who many people know, came to this area and studied with Baskin. Stephen Hannock, a wonderful painter. Michael Kutch, an artist who we also show in the gallery, along with Mosher, was a student of Baskin's. Many, Zachary Ehrenreich, I'm going to leave a few out now, Mark Weiss. There were a number of artists that he was very generous to.
That's really nice to hear. I'm curious where you thought Baskin saw this funeral cortege in his whole portfolio in his life. You know, I think of it as a brilliant piece in there, but it's probably because I know that better than any of his others.
Well, he saw it as a brilliant piece.
Yeah.
He saw most of his work as brilliant pieces. But yes, no, certainly it was something he was proud to have done. You know, he gave it his all. He worked on it. He knew it was an important piece, and he knew it was an important public piece. And I think he was very proud of it.
Did he ever say anything to you about the rest of the memorial and the setting of his piece? Because I think that's just, I mentioned to you, I think that's also beautiful and brilliant.
Yeah, you know, he did. In fact, he was more generous to that memorial than he often is. And as far as the memorial as a whole, walking through, it was often disparaging. He could be of other works. You know, he was not a fan of op art, pop art, abstract art, whatever he saw as the flavor of the day, as it were. But I don't recall him saying anything negative about the memorial itself. And as we were walking through it, he was quite impressed, as I recall, grandeur of it and the scope of it and the size of it.
Yeah, it really is. I think it's a remarkable memorial for all of those reasons. And his
Yes, I really encourage everyone to go and see it. I encourage everyone to go to the FDR Memorial Legacy site and see what's going on. And, you know, it's an important part of this country's history. We have a lot to learn from FDR. I wish people spent more time learning about that history, because I think it could be quite relevant to today's time.
It warms my cockles of my heart to hear someone push for history. So thank you.
Oh, well,
And Baskin was a great historian. He really did know both the country's history, the history of art, and that's why he's written so much about artists who have come before him. You know, he was not, during his lifetime, he was generally not the in artist of the day, say, or the favorite, but he certainly respected the history of art and knew whose shoulders he was standing on.
well, I think what you have shared today also, Rich, and Thais's framing, you know, helps us who are in the field of education and outreach, making sure that new generations, when they go through the memorial, that they understand who is in that funeral cortege and why. That story really excites me, to be able to make the linkage between Leonard Baskin and why did he put in James Baldwin, and who is James Baldwin, and why him, and what did that really mean? And that really excites me for thinking about firing up young folks when they're coming through and generating new threads and new underrepresented stories to the memorial.
I think
So
there is a link on your site to our site, and if people go there, I should say, you will see some other portraits. If you go to Baskin's site, in our current show, you'll see some other portraits he did of Baldwin. And he actually did a book, a fine press book, in a Ghana press, of Baldwin's unpublished poetry, which was at the end of Baldwin's life. Unfortunately, we ended up with some portraits of Baldwin. It ended up being a memorial volume.
Thanks for sharing that. Kelly?
Wonderful. Well, thank you both, Rich and Thaisa. This has been such a great event, and we're so excited to have you today. On behalf of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, we thank you for participating in today's discussion. So thank you again. Hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye now.